Rules for what? This time we're talking about radicalisation on the internet. The processes through which people become more and more and more right-wing, and the ways in which their actions become more politically significant as well. We're going to have an interview with Non-Compete, who's a YouTuber who's been doing a lot of work on this idea called the PewdiePipeline. So PewDiePie is this YouTuber. He's the most popular single YouTuber in the world. He's got 90 million subscribers on YouTube, so it's a huge fan base, huge fan base. The Christchurch shooter, before starting to kill people, said subscribe to PewDiePie, as it was kind of a part of a meme to try and get PewDiePie to remain on the number one spot on YouTube. His content used to be mostly oriented towards gaming, and it's now become a kind of general overview of like meme culture on the internet. So he does meme response videos. He does also kind of talking to camera. He does lots of videos that are about himself and the various kind of controversies he's been involved in. There's a much more thorough introduction to PewDiePie, who he is, on that video. So I recommend you go and watch that. That'll be in the show notes. It's called the PewDiePipeline. And the idea basically is that PewDiePie and other kind of online people, other internet comics really, but commentators more generally also, form a kind of pipeline that takes people from edgy humour and just kind of slightly abrasive style of engaging with politics or engaging with the world, or kind of a nihilistic attitude, and takes them slowly, bit by bit, through a sequence of kind of radicalisation steps and puts them in the far right. How it is that people go from watching this stuff, which seems comparatively innocuous, to becoming really, really far right Nazis, basically, on the internet, and the radicalisation process as a whole. That interview's coming up in a bit, but first we're going to talk about other facets of internet culture. For example, Alex, you wanted to talk about cringe videos.
So I think the reason we want to talk about radicalisation, just to back up a little bit, is that it seems to be that radicalisation through the PewDiePipeline, so-called, is like the prime example of radicalisation today. And that actually doesn't have to be left or right. A lot of like internet anarchists, internet communists came to their ideology not through struggle, but through watching content on YouTube. It's an interesting phenomena. And so to really understand why we have these reactionary groupings in America and UK, across the world, and why they're having such influence in our societies, is we need to understand how they became that way. And primarily it's through consuming content ultimately, and starting out with very innocuous things. We need to start thinking about fairly innocuous content on YouTube and other internet platforms that can start the process of radicalisation. And a prime example of these are what's known as cringe videos. And cringe is a very popular kind of genre on the internet in general. Content, pictures, videos that make you like kind of square up inside and just think, oh, how awful if that was me.
Fixated on often quite like minor social embarrassments or kind of faux pas. It's I think quite straightforwardly quite a conservative social form.
There's a lot of shame involved, shaming as well, public shaming, and a subset of this genre of content has become the feminist cringe video, the SJW cringe video, in which there's just compilations of clips after clips of people expressing feminist views or other kind of liberation-focused views in what would be classified by like an internet reactionist in a cringe manner. All these clips bundled together into hours-long compilations, which are then queued up by the algorithm as similar content and can just be played pretty much continuously 24/7 for a number of days. It's this kind of like initial kind of break where you find yourself laughing at people who are concerned with the liberation of oppressed groups, which kind of starts the process, and Emerican Johnson talks about this in our interview, of like dehumanization. And you have a really concerted effort on the far right and in fascist circles online to build up these enemies of which you can then laugh at and then fight against, oppose, mock. We see this with Antifa. The classic image of an American anti-fascist, like thin-armed, I guess lispy queer who like doesn't conform to any gender and has dyed hair and doesn't wash. And you also have the same thing with a similar image being constructed as the SJW, dyed hair, college student. Think of all the reactionary tropes you can bundle into one person, and then there you got them.
The figure of fun in these videos is often some kind of combination of like two things that are absolutely taboo on the far right. One is really, really caring about something, and the other is a kind of effeminization or a kind of lack of masculine characteristics.
And this goes to a wider point of like cynicism and irony on the internet, in which sincerity and heartfelt fighting for a better world is immediately taken down, mocked, in a way that we haven't really seen in kind of other periods of history. A lot of these movements, communist movements, liberation movements, they were mocked, but they were taken as dangerous. They were taken as like something that should be considered by wider society. And there was a clear process in which initial mockery turned to fear, and then eventually turned to acceptance, and eventually these movements kind of won a certain advancements in situations. And this kind of like overt studied cynicism ultimately tries to disrupt that process and keep these people as objects to mock and laughing stock, and so they never move on to the stage of actually winning victories or making gains. And
the kind of summary meme of this approach to the world, that everything that is earnestly felt that deserves to be mocked, is a thing called the clown world meme, which you might see around. It's Pepe the Frog. It's kind of this green frog that's become very popular in far-right circles, but with a clown nose and a clown wig on, multicoloured clown wig. And the idea is that instead of being angry with this world, the far right is pretending often to be just kind of disappointed with it, or mocking it, or reveling in its absurdity. And I think what's important to note is that although this seems like a different kind of attitude to social justice or liberation movements, or indeed to the absurdities of the contemporary world, it is completely coherent with and continuous with a cynicism that admits nothing but the most reactionary of behavioural norms.
I mean, this is not exactly a new thing, and we can like kind of pinpoint its development in programs like South Park, where the ultimate figure of mockery on South Park is someone who takes themselves sincerely and tries to sincerely change things.
12 Rules for What is, of course, not anti-mockery and not anti-humour. We're anti a kind of style of humour that obsesses in punching down.
Hi, Sam here. At this point of the conversation, we turn back to talking about radicalisation on the internet more generally, and talking about the pewdiepipeline in particular. You should also note there's a content warning for this episode for discussions of sexual violence, anti-Semitism, and mass murder.
So we go from making jokes, and in the course of, this could happen over the course of months, could happen over the course of years. It could even happen much faster. So in the case of the Finsbury Mosque attack, there was the guy who drove the van into the crowd of people going to Friday prayers, or just coming out of Friday prayers. He had self-radicalised using theories of or conspiracy theories of white genocide on the internet over the course of, I think it was 3 weeks.
Well, initially was set off by a BBC drama about child abuse in Rotherham.
Right. And so he very quickly took kind of outrage about child abuse and very quickly radicalised himself and concluded that the thing he had to do was attempt to commit mass murder. So there's a really kind of there's a well-structured pipeline of information that takes people from kind of conventional right-wing views all the way over to the far right very rapidly.
The interesting thing about this pipeline, of course, is like it's not really a pipeline, in that it's kind of like a multi-formed, interrelating system, in which like the base makes they each make each other more and more acceptable. So the people out there saying the really shocking Holocaust denial stuff makes the lower level ironic humour pale in comparison, but then the ferments created by the Holocaust jokes or the racist jokes or whatever then gives succor and pushes up the next generation of these like more hardcore extremist kind of people. So it's a really interesting way, kind of people. I imagine people probably move between the two throughout. We haven't ever been in this position, but you imagine you would cycle between more and less extreme content until eventually finding yourself more in the upper tiers of this thing.
What's kind of, I guess, like a bit sad about doing this episode is that it's now 2019, July 2019, and we could have done this episode in 2014. The radicalisation that was going on 4chan, on B, on Poll, was started then. It's been going on for 5 years, and not much has changed, except that the kind of conflict that was going on Poll at that point has actually just become a kind of a monocultural.
Do you want to explain what Poll is real quick?
Yeah, so Poll is one of the boards on the website 4chan, and it's also perhaps more significant, also a board on a different website called 8chan. 4chan, although it's often understood as the kind of outer reaches of the internet, to some extent that's still true, but actually 8chan has really usurped it. And so yeah, and 8chan is the place where the Christchurch shooter posted a link to his live stream before he shot people. It's the place where the manifesto was first posted, in addition to being emailed out to all these news organizations.
I mean, the Christchurch shooter and a lot of these current crop of shooters are all a product of probably 2014 4chan, Poll, and 8chan, if 8chan was around then.
It was.
It was. Brandon Tarrant spent about 2 years planning his attack. He spent however the fuck long before that becoming who he turned out to be. It's highly likely that he got radicalised around 2014 on these forums. And so what we're really seeing is that kind of the colonisation of Poll and B and, 4chan and 8chan by Nazis is really coming home to roost. This is a true corruption of like a popular website, that something like Stormfront, for example, which is another white supremacist forum,
or Iron March,
would never be able to achieve because it doesn't have the cultural cachet of formerly mainstream website.
There are some interesting arguments about like why it is specifically the Chan websites, which is basically just kind of an image board, very simple, very, very simple in comparison to the kind of slick interface of YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, one of the kind of big stacks. There's an idea about why, there's kind of interesting argument about why they would have become the place where radicalisation happened most freely. Now, one is that they just have no moderation policy, or basically no moderation policy. There are different boards on these sites, so different kind of sections of the website where people can post more or less whatever they want in accordance with the moderation rules of that particular section. There's a blanket rule across the whole of the website against child pornography. But apart from that, that's the only, I think, blanket rule. And so what this means is that you get this kind of ghettoization, even within 8chan, even within 4chan, of different kind of rules and different kinds of moderation policies. So the New Zealand police, for example, applied to the server owner of 8chan to have the footage or the original archive, the IP address of the person who had posted in the threads that were the Christchurch shooter had set up, tried to get this information from the server owner, and the server owner sent this email back to them saying, fuck off, basically. Like, this is it, we're in America, you can't do anything to us, your culture doesn't matter to us. And so the simple structure of the internet allows for this kind of website to appear, and people can't really do anything about it. The other kind of significant feature about Chan websites is that they are also self-refreshing. So they have no memory at all. There's no archive on these websites, though there are separate websites that archive for them. And what that means is
the interval between everything getting deleted.
So on 4chan, it's extremely quick. So on the most popular boards, there are kind of 10 or 20 pages, and each one has, I think, 10 or 20 posts on. And so only the top, say, 400, 200, 100, depending on how the settings are, survive, and everything else is deleted. Now, if you imagine you have people posting on these threads kind of several times a second, which is true of the most popular boards on 4chan, that means that if no one replies to your post, within literally like a few minutes, your post has been deleted forever. And there's no chance of recovering it. Which means that you have to post something that will attract massive amounts of very quick attention, or it just will disappear entirely. And what that means is posting ever more extreme ideas. The other thing this contributes to is the fact there's no cultural memory. And so in order to actually establish a kind of robust culture on a particular website, what you have to do is just post the same shit over and 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 over again. And once you've done that, You have a kind of a meme culture that is endlessly producing more of the same stuff, but it's also endlessly radicalizing or pushing towards the greater and greater extremes.
You can also see a similar tendency towards controversy on more traditional platforms like YouTube, where you see these creators creating more and more controversial videos because the YouTube algorithm doesn't particularly care if your video is very disliked, as long as it's driving traffic towards the adverts that are attached to your video. So there is also a tendency for people to start off kind of moderate and fluffy and end up raging Nazi monsters. Or you see this, for example, people like Stefan Molyneux, who was never a nice person. He started out as like a right-wing, weird, culty leader almost. He advocated disconnecting from family members who didn't accept you for who you were. He was a bad guy. And around the time of Trump, he pivoted into, overt, like, kind of white nationalism, strong borders, which, for a libertarian, is weird.
It's not that weird. There are people like Hans Hermann Hoppe in the libertarian movement who have been trying to combine like a kind of social conservatism with basically free market ideology. Hans Hermann Hoppe's most controversial and most famous moment was when he said that the chief advantage of having strictly voluntarist associational communities, basically kind of a free market and no state, was that you could ban gay people from your community.
Okay, so now I understand who that guy is, because I was listening to the Faraday Speaks podcast on It's Going Down, and he mentioned that as part of his pipeline. He was like, first I was doing the jokes, and then I was doing the Hoppe memes, and then I went on to the helicopter memes. And
helicopter memes are about Pinochet.
Pinochet throwing out political dissidents, left-wingers out of helicopters to their deaths. You see this tendency quite a lot, these radicalizations that happen over time, these tendency towards controversy. You see it in the genre of particular videos of debates. So
yeah, internet blood sports, they're called.
Internet blood sports, where you get the two most extreme people you can find and face them off in some epic debate that lasts for like 5 hours or whatever. Again, the tendency there is you're not going to get some liberal Democrat to go and debate, 5p cards on plastic bags. Those debate organisers think there's some value in trying to shoot down these people.
So Rebecca Lewis of the Data and Society report, although we have criticisms of the way that report was carried out, particularly about things like sample size, basically concludes that what she calls the alternative influence network operates on basically the same principles as the influence network. So people are looking to establish an alternative sense of credibility based on things like their relatability, their authenticity, their accountability. And so often these are very, very intimate streams. Often they go on for kind of 5 or 6 hours, and it's literally just one person broadcasting their message from their room into your room. And it's really interesting that like the bedroom has become the site of consumption of the far right, whereas before it might have been, say, the pub or the far right meeting or even the street. You wanted to say something about this, about the lack of physical contact that goes into radicalization now.
Well, just quickly on the YouTube thing, it is true that early on YouTube, right wingers and particularly far right creators understood the algorithm much more comprehensively than any kind of leftist content did. They realised they had to post something every day. It had to be long, so you could fit adverts onto it. You had to tend towards controversy, and so what we had in like maybe even a few years ago, before the rise of a conscious like left movement on YouTube, this is why like the algorithm still tends towards these right-wing things, because there's just so many videos all linking into each other. The interesting thing about internet radicalization in particular, or radicalization as the main form of radicalization today, is that it's a kind of at one point it's individualized, and at the same point it's still collectivized. It happens mainly on your own, consuming content, consuming user-generated content, forum posts, whatever, videos, on your own, constantly, all the time. Maybe you don't have a job, you spend the whole day watching these things. And unlike maybe say in the 1970s or 80s, 90s, when the internet wasn't a hegemonic thing, you had to physically go out, interact, be physical with other people in a room, which has completely like dropped away. We still have groups like Generation Identity and National Action who like deliberately set up gyms and do train together, things like that. They have these camps, but these are really the exception now, especially when we're talking about the YouTube radicalisation, the alt-right. It all happens in bedrooms, and ultimately the interesting thing is we put a call out for people's stories about how they got radicalised and how they got out of the alt-right. And interestingly as well, the de-radicalisation process came from internal introspection as well. It wasn't really like an intervention from an outside force. It was actually just finding different content. So it's not like someone's coming in and saying, right, you are a Nazi, this has gone on far too long, you're well into it. It just happened because they ended up watching different videos, which is like, I find that like 1 part hurtful, like 12 parts terrifying. It says quite a lot about how like a lot of people like process information and build their beliefs, in that all you have to do to jump out of an ideology or jump out of a perspective of thinking is just watch different content and take on board that content instead.
Hi, Sam again. Alex is now going to read from one of the de-radicalisation stories we were sent. Thank you for all your contributions.
So it says, so funny enough, I discovered ContraPoints because an anti-SJW YouTuber who I followed, easy on me, and then in brackets, pretty sure he's also turned to left wing since then, made a video trying to debunk her video, What is Gender? I found her points really convincing and his counter-arguments to be really bad. Plus I really liked the aesthetic of the Contra video, so I decided to check out some of her other videos. The first thing her videos convinced me of was that gender exists on the spectrum. Because of people I know in my personal life, even when I was alt-right, I was still accepting of trans people. So it didn't take much to convince me of the validity of non-binary identities.
What's kind of interesting, I think, is how uneven the politicization really is. People have like a completely non-systematic view of good, bad, etc. Even on the far right, like people who are kind of grabbing at straws because there's no real like system of education. There's no like curriculum of being on the far right. Like people just have more or less a random collection of views.
It's utterly non-ideological why a lot of these people get involved in these forums and in the alt-right, internet alt-right. Like it's not someone's convinced of a political ideology and then seeks out to meet other people who are also convinced of their ideology. They're just disaffected, alienated losers who like just end up with other disaffected, alienated losers.
Yeah,
and build their community around a Donald subreddit or whatever. Or
it's entirely possible that mode of radicalization could exist equally well for the left, and in some sense it does. So there's this really interesting thing I recommend people go and read by Joshua Citarella called Politigram and the Post-Left. So Politigram is an Instagram, and it's basically a survey of the ways in which politicization happens on Instagram around not like a particular set of political ideologies that already exist, but around a kind of random ideology generator. People are hunting out the new, the most niche thing, the most kind of explosive and strange thing. You get, like anarchists, monarchists, primitivist traditionalists, caliphatists, nationalist Trotskyism, dharmic eco-reactionary Bolshevism. I'm reading here. Dharmic eco-reactionary Bolshevism.
Wow. Eco-reactionary?
Eco-reactionary
What does that mean? What's the specific eco-reaction?
Well, I guess so. I guess like it means something like eco-fascism, or it means that you have a sense of the way that life should be led that is basically contained to very limited resource consumption, because you think this is what people lived like in, say, for example, the 50s in America, or in the 1800s. So you become eco-reactionary. The dharmic, I can't really understand why that might be so, but I guess it pertains to a kind of cosmic order, and Christian Bolshevism and etc. And so what's really functioning here is not like an attempt to radicalize oneself into a political direction, or even a coherent conspiracy theory, but just like an attempt to be as strange, as interesting, as convoluted as possible in your political beliefs. There's a YouTube channel called JReg. His whole thing is anti-centrism. The idea that all political ideas are equally interesting and equally valid, apart from the ones that everyone holds normally. So apart from conventional liberalism, the centre right, the centre left, those are the wrong ideas. But like the far right authoritarians, far right libertarians, ANCAPs, anarcho-communists, Stalinists. Like, these people are correct, and in fact, they are all the same. Ultimately, single-dimensional political axis in which the center is like one side, and everything else
It's good.
is good, and it's on the other side. Yeah, I mean,
That's lunacy.
it's complete. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah, like, and self-knowingly so, and the whole channel is absurd. But I think it is absurd, but it also does capture something.
Does he believe it? Can you tell?
So there are all these videos where he's like, well, I'm now going to tell you guys what my real political ideology is, and then something absurd happens, like he gets beaten up by a bear just before he's going to tell you, or like,
Okay, so he doesn't believe it.
I don't really know. I mean, like, it's possible that he's just a centrist.
Everyone on the internet's just been like, I already poisoned to fuck. I can't tell what's real and what's not anymore.
But that's, yeah, I mean, I think that has to some extent passed its sell-by date as a position, though.
Yeah, and interestingly, the reaction to the irony poisoning now is like all this, the whole wholesome meme thing, for example, but
Yes.
also like it's suddenly cool to care about the issues again, like it was in the 90s.
Yeah. Or even in the early 2000s, right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole period after 2008, or indeed just after like 2001, where people, mass protest against the Iraq War, etc. And then after 2008, there's like mass movements against social inequality. And these collapse and die. And, it's only really in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, maybe, that this kind of tide of total irony politics has become like a major thing.
Hi, Sam again. Here's some more of that deradicalisation letter.
I think the last thing I turned left wing on was economic issues. I was vehemently anti-communist when I was not right. I remember ironically trying to dissuade people from socialism by saying that Nazis were socialist, even though I probably agreed with a lot of their views. I remember not wanting to watch ContraPoints' videos on capitalism for fear of being convinced otherwise, I guess.
Interesting.
When I eventually did watch it, it convinced me that capitalism has some serious problems and I should read Marx to learn more about it. However, neither of those videos or the Marx that I read convinced me that a communist system would be better to a capitalist one. I came to the conclusion through real-world experience. I started working my full-time job, and the working condition I experienced there put a lot of Marx's ideas into context for me. To give you an idea, the owner of the factory almost never stepped foot into the factory. I'd only seen him there once in the 4 months I'd worked there. Meanwhile, my co-worker was beyond retirement age, couldn't even afford to buy new clothes, even with overtime. This is what ultimately put the Marx and Kropotkin that I read into context and convinced me that we need a fundamental reorganisation of the economy.
Now we're going to have an interview with Emerican Johnson, who goes by Non-Compete on YouTube.
So we're here with Emerican Johnson, who goes by Non-Compete on YouTube, a really fantastic channel, who's done a lot of work in terms of getting people to understand the kind of mechanisms of radicalisation online, getting people to understand the ways in which people are being pulled into the far right from just kind of watching and being involved in this online world of YouTube videos and the processes by which that takes these tiny, I guess, like kind of fairly commonly held racist and sexist beliefs and just blows them out of all proportion, just like transforms them into these monstrous kind of configurations of like really far right thinking. The reason why we're doing this interview is because we think it's incredibly important to not only understand that process, but also to try and intervene in that process. And Non-Compete is one of the people who's been doing, or Emerican Johnson is one of the people who's been doing like a huge amount of work on YouTube to de-radicalize people. So that's, it's really kind of valuable work. So my first question is about the notion of reality collapse. Or kind of reality fragmentation. One of the kind of features of the internet is this very well-known process by which people kind of shard off into little, I guess, kind of like worlds of their own. Is this a process that exclusively benefits the right, or does the left have something to gain from this? If by the left we understand something like a kind of a universalism or an attempt to understand like the human in their kind of totality, like, is there anything the left can gain from this process of kind of fracturing reality?
That's a really good question. I would say that it definitely, in my opinion, I mean, leftism is all about coming together. So for me, from my perspective, I think that the fragmentation of people into these little, groups or tribes or whatever you want to call them, that's something that definitely benefits the far right. That's what ethnocentrism and nationalism and all these different right-wing ideologies are all about. It's like splintering people off, otherizing people. So I mean, I guess there are advantages in terms of the fact that we can have our own spaces online as like a revolutionary base. But I think, we should be venturing outside of those bases and making connections to other people and signal boosting people from, other parts of the world and other perspectives as much as we can. So I would say that, to me, the fragmentation is a symptom of things drifting farther to the right. I don't really see that as like I wouldn't call that like human nature or anything like that. I think that's actually something that's imposed on us by material conditions, by ideology. So I would say that we should be trying to reverse that trend, if anything.
The big video you have on this is obviously the PewDiePipeline, which got nearly 500,000 views, I think, last time I checked, which is incredible.
Yeah.
Where do you think this process of alt-right radicalization started? Can you see like a certain point in the internet where it kind of started kicking off properly? Because like for when I grew up, the internet was like a kind of a happy place where you posted cat pictures and had silly memes like Nyan Cat and lolcat and other cat related memes, and suddenly we're in a position where we have like Nazi frogs and Nazi clowns and people coming out onto the streets and killing a lot of people because of, and repeating these new internet memes. Where did it start?
Yeah, so it did kind of sneak up on us. I mean, it snuck up on me for sure, but I will also say that I've been active on the internet since around the mid 90s when I was, I guess, in middle school, and I've been aware of the far right presence on the internet, nationalists, Nazis on the internet for a very long time. In fact, when I was in high school, it's when I first discovered the website Stormfront. It was a forum. So that must have been like late 90s, probably early 2000s. But, they've been around for a very, very long time, but they were very deeply undercover. But I managed to find them just in like casual searching. I just had kind of a morbid curiosity. I wasn't a Nazi myself. I never posted there myself, but I did kind of troll around and lurk around in their forums, and I just kind of wanted to see because what, this kind of speaks to the point. When I was in high school, and I saw news reports about, neo-Nazis and that sort of thing, marching, and because I'm from South Carolina, we do have, like the KKK and neo-Nazis in the deep south of the United States of America. And so I was like, who are these people? When I was in high school, I remember having that kind of thought, having that morbid curiosity. So that's how I actually just started searching around, and I found, their forums, and I saw what they were talking about. So they've been laying the foundations for a very long time. I think fascism never really died. It goes through cycles. It goes through phases. It's a very opportunistic ideology. So it's always, kind of waiting for the right moment to surface again. And I think that, I can only speculate, but I would imagine that they saw a big opportunity probably around the early 2010s, previous to Gamergate. They were probably starting to see these opportunities as feminism and BuzzFeed feminism and pop feminism and other sorts of, social justice. And I'm not saying that with, ironically, but social justice movements were starting to get kind of mainstreamed. You started to see LGBT people becoming more mainstreamed and normalized. And I think I'm guessing that they probably started putting their antennas up at that point. And so then when Gamergate happened, you had this explosion. I think there were people ready on the sidelines to kind of swoop in and inject that far-right ideology into the discussion. And I think it happened, it really happened in such a subtle way. I think if you weren't, I wasn't super political at that time, especially I wasn't aware of the far-right, far-left kind of stuff when Gamergate was going on. And so I didn't even really notice it happening until, suddenly I turned around and there's all these far-right quote unquote skeptics and everything. So it did take me personally by surprise, although I've talked to other people who were more active in far-left spaces and, for a longer time than me. I'm a little bit new to the left myself. And I think some people did see it coming. And I think that the far right, people on the far left saw it coming for a long time. And people on the far right, I think they've been planning it for quite some time and just waiting for the right moment to inject themselves into the popular culture. A planned ambush or sneak attack is what it looks like to me.
There's also this kind of other history of the internet, I guess, which is that people thinking that the internet is basically a kind of a right libertarian project. So people like Tim May and others who are writing things like the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. And what they mean by anarchism is kind of a right anarchism, so it's kind of anarcho-capitalism, right? And they are obsessed with the intrusions of the state into their lives. And they want to produce these separate regimes or kind of separate areas where they can freely experiment with ideas and say whatever they want. And the internet really affords them that.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe before the internet seemed like a Nazi space or like a fascist space, I think before that, I think it seemed like its politicization through these listservs and parts of the early internet was mostly on the kind of right libertarian front. And there have been lots of studies about the way in which people who were right libertarians, slowly as they discover what it is that they want in their kind of voluntarist communities, they discover that, it's just white people, right? And so there is a kind of like a transformation from like the right libertarian position into the fascist position. And that's, I guess, like kind of afforded, or like that's kind of made possible by the network infrastructure of the internet, or the kind of culture of the internet does transform in this way. So I wanted to go back on the thing that you mentioned about like SJWs, social justice warriors, which is the term that the right uses for kind of the left. It seemed like after the Obama era, there was a big turn towards mass cynicism, towards absolutely everything, about the possibility of social change, about the possibility of seriously caring about things. And that seems to collapse around 2014, the late Obama era. How do you see the role of like cynicism or moralism or earnestness as like functioning in internet culture?
Oh, it's fundamental to the online aspects of the right-wing creep, I think. And, it started, I think to go back to your earlier comments about crypto anarchism, that's absolutely intrinsically tied in with the cynicism that you're talking about. And if you look at, some of the biggest springboards for a lot of this fascist activity would be like 4chan and 8chan. And the people who were intrinsic in starting those sites, the founders of those sites, present a kind of a crypto anarchist worldview, and that had a lot to do with the ideological foundations. People don't think of 4chan and 8chan as having ideological foundations, but if you read interviews with the founders, the original people who started the sites, they definitely have that deep mistrust of the state. They have a lot of those crypto anarchist platforms built into their vision for why they started those sites. And on those sites is where you saw that cynicism really just hyper develop very rapidly, to where you have these memes being generated en masse that are just rooted in this kind of hateful, spiteful, cynical, morally, rudderless avenues of human thought. And it's, I think it's definitely been very powerful tapping into that cynicism. And the other thing is that kind of cynicism and that kind of dark humor and that kind of edginess, that's kind of a big part of how we as, I'm a cis heterosexual man myself. And I'll say that, like, at least in the United States where I'm from, in my part of the country, that was a big part of like the culture of boyhood. And, being a young man, there's a lot of that kind of like rowdy, edgy kind of humor, a lot of punching down jokes just to kind of, see how far we can push the envelope with each other. And so I think it dovetailed really, I won't say nicely, but it dovetailed very profoundly, where you have the crypto anarchist platforms, and then you have the fascists on the sidelines that are kind of, agitating in their own way. And I found that the hardcore Nazis, the hardcore fascists, are actually very, very savvy when it comes to agitation and propaganda and, steering the direction of these kinds of like emotionally unbridled energies. Yeah, and it also ties in with the frustration and the anger of capitalism. A lot of people like me who are like cishet, white, American guys, we had this dream presented to us where like, if you do all these things, if you go to college, if you do this, if you do that, then everything will be fine for you, right? And then the economy is just completely in the crapper, starting around 2008 is whenever I really started to feel the pinch, and I really started to realize that this American dream that was presented to me was really crumbling. So, I felt anger and frustration as well. Fortunately for me, I was a bit older when that happened. I was in my mid to late 20s when the economy really started to tank, and a lot of that. But when you have these millennials and you have these younger people, they were at that age where they were just starting to go out into the world. So I think you have a lot of angry young white men. They're being oppressed by capitalism in certain ways. They're not getting everything that they bargained for, and the fascists and the cynics and the toxic elements of online society were able to come in pretty early and focus this energy and figure out how to kind of take advantage of it and turn this into a real movement. A huge reason why fascism is so powerful and on the rise today in so many countries.
One of the, I want to kind of just give a recommendation to our listeners. You did a video about masculinity. Which is just you talking to camera for like 7 minutes, something like that. It's a really great video. And in that video, you talk about the power of the word gay to kind of function in like masculine spaces, in like, the changing rooms for, PE, gym class, right? Like the power of that word to describe anything that seems to deviate even like the tiniest bit from the most like absolute kind of macho. That name calling and that kind of aggression to anything that is even slightly deviant or even slightly like unusual, or not even unusual, just kind of isn't the absolutely most macho thing. Kind of continues on these two websites we were talking about, 4chan, 8chan, except that it's no longer about being gay. On 4chan, it's, there are kind of a whole range of things, but on 8chan poll, it's I'm not going to say the word, but it's like a racial slur for Jewish people. Right, and if you just look at these threads, that's the only thing that happens in these threads. Somebody posts something, I guess like undercover leftist or undercover, kind of liberal, like comes on the site and is like, well, let's talk honestly about our experiences with, people of other races, right? And then just like the whole thread is just this name calling, just kind of, calling people, horrible, offensive things. So I think that really much remains.
There's also the word autistic gets used as an insult a lot nowadays, in a very similar way. And then there's the word cuck, and I think the word cuck is very interesting because I actually saw that's one of the words that I saw being used frequently on Stormfront 2 decades ago when I was in high school. They were using those words, and that's a very racially charged word, the way that those hardcore fascists use it. They have a very specific racially motivated underpinning for when they use that word. And so to see that go mainstream, to me personally, just because I had seen it in these hardcore Nazi spaces a very long time ago, I mean, that was just really jarring to me to see that go mainstream. And it really showed me that these hardcore Nazis and fascists were absolutely working as agent provocateurs to inject their ideological positions into this sort of cynical social undercurrent. And also, just to go back to the element of youth, I think that when all young people of all genders, when you're a teenager, you start to have this kind of fascination with your power, in the concept of power and having power over other people, and you start to want to push power, that you feel burdened, whether it's your parents, your teachers, whatever. You want to resist against that power, and you want to start experimenting with like exercising your own power in the world. And there are healthy ways to do that, so like maybe somebody can go out and volunteer or something and show that they can really affect change in their community. But if we're stifled emotionally, then suddenly we find these really unhealthy ways of kind of trying to impose power over other people. And I think words, when young kids, teenagers start to discover that there are these very powerful words, and you could say one word, you could say a racial slur, you could say something homophobic and get a reaction out of somebody, get a reaction out of an adult in your life even. I think it's almost has this kind of mystical quality to a lot of teenagers if they're not properly guided to realize how harmful it really is and how harmful that kind of power can be. So I think this all, mixes together disturbingly.
I think that's so true. And I'm thinking back to when I was a teenager, and the worst I got when I was going towards the right wing was I became a dickhead, new atheist Richard Dawkins kind of person, which a lot of people of my age would probably have gone through at certain points. And I lived in terror of being accused of being gay. It was at some points, the whole neurosis was completely all consuming for in growing up and being in school, and I can totally see how this could have just diverted itself into a lot of time on the computer, a lot of playing out these kind of reactionary opinions and thinking with other people on forums like 4chan. I'm just thankful it didn't happen, but it happened to a lot of people, I think.
Just to go back to the use of the word cuck, I think that like speaks to just how deeply gendered these spaces are as well. Like just how much there is in radicalization, how much the feelings, we've gone through a few of them, like obviously kind of a latent racism, a profound cynicism towards the possibilities of like the world, but also like perhaps even kind of just as fundamental as those two, like a profoundly gendered hatred of women, and a desire to like possess, and a like fascination with sexual violence.
I had a question about the kind of edgy humor that you talk about in the first PewDiePie video, and obviously we're not, like, I think you say this in the next video, we're not against like dark humor or like humor that deals with difficult topics. I think that's often the best comedy is that kind of comedy that deals with like real issues. I wondered if you could talk about the way kind of edgy humor is used by people like PewDiePie and I guess JonTron, these kind of huge kind of YouTubers, and what makes that kind of edgy humor a negative thing that we need to be arguing against and opposing, as compared to humor that deals with dark topics or that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I would make the specific, I would specifically highlight humor that is punching down, or humor that is otherizing or dehumanizing certain, segments of the population as being what's truly problematic. So, it's absolutely okay to have humor about sensitive topics, but when you're punching down, just for anybody who's not familiar with this terminology, punching up is when you're punching like people who have power over you or people who have power over society. Punching down is when you are making fun of or making jokes about people who have less power, who are vulnerable, who are oppressed. And so, of course, punching down would usually target people like LGBTQ+, racial minorities, religious minorities, and so on and so on. So, yeah, I would definitely say that the biggest problem with the kind of humor that we're seeing in the mainstream on these YouTube channels nowadays is that it is not just punching down, but it is otherizing and dehumanizing people. Yeah, humor has this aspect where it makes us more comfortable with things, or it makes it easier to discuss things. It gets things, it sort of like sets a foundation in your mind for these kinds of thoughts. And when you're otherizing people in a joking manner, you're basically laying the foundation for what is psychologically known as pseudo-speciation. And so pseudo-speciation is this process where you basically convince yourself that people in whatever group are not actually humans, or they're less human than you are, or you're more human than they are. And this is an important, if you really want to understand how pseudo-speciation works, the people who have really pioneered this concept and been able to weaponize it very effectively are entities like the United States military, because pseudo-speciation is vital in convincing young soldiers to go out and murder other people, to murder other human beings. We have like innate psychological blocks that prevent us from wanting to hurt other people. There's a reason that most of us don't go around just punching some random stranger on the street. We kind of, have this natural empathy for other human beings. But when you tear that empathy away by dehumanizing somebody, it makes you more prone to then engage in violent speech, which then makes it more easy for you to engage in physical violence. Just to make this really, really clear, because I think this is a really important point. When we talk about, I didn't come up with the term, but I like to call it stochastic violence. I think that's the best term for what we're talking about, because stochastic violence is a process where agent provocateurs, basically terrorists, are able to essentially make conditions better for random acts of terror and violence to occur. And the way they do this is by just creating this general sort of social current of pseudo-speciation and anger and hatred and distrust and prejudice. And they kind of like lay the foundations, plant these seeds. And so I presented it as the pyramid of stochastic violence, which is to say that you elevate up through these stages, and I base this on research that's done on sexual violence. So there's a pyramid of violence that sexual violence researchers have come up with. It's a pyramid because as you go up to through the stages from joking to verbal violence to physical violence, as you move up through those stages, fewer and fewer people are going to actually graduate to the top. But the bigger the base, the more people will make it to the top. So it's not to say that every single person who ever makes an edgy, racist joke is going to go out and commit a mass shooting. That's not the point. The point is that the more people who joke about it and, make it a comfortable, safe thing to do to make a racist joke or a homophobic joke, the more people who are having those kinds of joking conversations, the more people are going to actually start taking it seriously and engage in actual verbal violence. And the more people who are doing that, the more people are going to start to go out and perform acts of physical violence. It's a situation where it's literally physically dangerous to vulnerable people for to become the targets of these kinds of down punching, prejudicial jokes, because it creates an atmosphere that makes it much more likely for people to graduate up to verbal violence and then on to physical violence, as we're seeing, unfortunately, playing out in the real world.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us as anti-fascists to make clear the consequences of these kind of things and lay out the processes that go behind them. Our past episode of our podcast we did on the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto, and we tried to we read it and we tried to explain it to people so they wouldn't have to read it. We picked out the important bits, tried to put it in context, because I genuinely don't think that thing should be read by a lot of people. But the thing that came to me out of that manifesto was it wasn't trying to appeal to a broad range of people. It wasn't trying to convince like hundreds of thousands of people of a certain ideology. It was trying to drag up people already quite high up on the pyramid into the final stage of violence, which I think is something that wasn't really grasped by a lot of people who were like analysing and talking about on the news and stuff, in that it wasn't like appealing to this mass, it was appealing to a very select group of people in very select spaces.
Can we talk about de-pseudo-speciation, the process by which people come to see others, people who are not in the same racial group as they are, people who are not the same gender as they are? How do those processes work? So how do people become kind of de-radicalized?
So first of all, it would depend on how far up the pyramid they've graduated. If they're towards the top of the pyramid, where they're the kinds of people who would be reading these manifestos that are coming out that are like literally calling for people to commit violence. If you're at the point where you're susceptible to that level of violence, that's going to require a totally different series of techniques and strategies to deprogram a person like that. That's basically somebody who has been deeply brainwashed at that point. And pseudo-speciation, in my opinion, based on the research I've done, it's very similar. Like once you get to those higher levels of prejudice and bigotry, it is a form of brainwashing. It has a lot of cult-like aspects to it. And as you graduate up to those levels to where you're starting to get really serious and ideologically fixed and fixated on that kind of hatred, that's when you start to get into the realm of actual brainwashing that needs to be like seriously deprogrammed. That is something that I think that not everyone should be trying to engage with. Like if you're talking about a serious hardcore Nazi who is ready to commit violence or who has already committed violence, obviously it's a dangerous thing to go and mess with those kinds of people. And that's something that takes a very specific set of skills and abilities and strengths that most of us don't have. So I would first of all like to say that if anybody's listening to this and they're thinking about going out and like deprogramming hardcore Nazis, just be very careful about that, because first of all, you got to be able to speak their language, which is why I think the best people for that job tend to be former Nazis themselves, people who have already deprogrammed. I think those people are well suited for doing that work. There's a fellow who's pretty viral these days, goes by Faraday Speaks, but his name's Caleb, and he has a YouTube channel, but he also has a Discord server where he and a bunch of other former fascists and neo-Nazis are, doing this really grueling, dangerous work of deprogramming Nazis. But that's not something that most people should be concerning themselves with. And the good thing about that is that if we're trying to reach people on the lower levels of the violence pyramid, not only is that easier and is that more accessible to all of us, but it's also like, in the grand scheme of things, probably much more effective to go after the base of the pyramid, because the sooner you can stop somebody from going up to those higher levels of the pyramid, the easier it is, and the more, I think, mass effect you can have. So, I would say that as a community, as a movement, we should be trying to target the lower levels of the pyramid and nipping the bud, as early in the process as possible, So that has to do with, any other kind of leftist ambition or goal. It's a matter of, organizing ourselves into, groups that actually have some cohesion, some systems in place for communication, security networks in place, and then going out and producing propaganda, agitating, and just trying to push the culture, trying to shift the Overton window, trying to make it not cool again to be racist, or maybe not cool for the first time, really, to be honest. But that's the thing. We got to be basically, I think it's got a lot to do with changing the culture. And you can look to former, like previous movements who have had great successes with this sort of thing. There are examples of like communications programs, like the LGBTQ plus community has done a lot of really amazing things in the past, going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, in terms of creating outreach campaigns, creating public support campaigns to normalize being gay, to make it, to put us a stigma on homophobic language. Those kinds of tools and tactics are what we need to be using to target the bases of the pyramid, and basically just, making it very clear. The thing about it is, and especially because this stuff is on, it's happening so predominantly on places like 4chan and 8chan and Stormfront and all these anonymous forums. The only way to really attack a problem like that is to change the culture. Because right now, it's kind of cool and hip and, fun to be a Nazi. But we have to make Nazis afraid, whether that is, that's not necessarily to say physically afraid, but we need to make them realize that it's not fun or funny or something that's going to be socially acceptable to make these kinds of jokes. And it's not an easy. It's a really complicated problem. It's not easy, but that's I think where we need to be kind of focusing our energy.
In the UK, there's a thing called Contest, the most famous part of which is Prevent, which is a kind of a 4-part, I guess, like counter-radicalisation strategy that the government puts out. And Prevent is really damaging, really damaging. It's increased surveillance of particularly the Muslim community in the UK. But in Contest 3.0, which was published, I think, in November 2018, so quite recently, there was kind of indication that there would be what they refer to as a step change in surveillance, that they were going to increase the amount of surveillance, particularly of far-right groups. How do you see the role of the state as an anarchist? How do you see the role of the state in deprogramming people, getting people out of these kind of groups? Do they have a role? Is there anything for them to do, or is that kind of not possible?
I mean, I can mostly speak for the United States of America, and in that instance, I would say, because I'm not as familiar with, the UK, but I would imagine that it's not that much different just based on what I do know. I don't trust the state in the United States of America at all, not one little bit, to be doing this kind of work. Because for one thing, you've got Nazis deeply embedded in the police, in the intelligence communities. Those are, you basically have the wolves watching the hen house. I mean, there's a reason that white nationalist fascistic terror, it was responsible for 100% of the politically motivated deaths in 2018 in the United States of America, and yet the president of the United States of America is not even willing to talk about white terrorism. There's very little attention being put on this situation. I mean, I am an anarchist. I don't believe that the state has our interests as, working people, vulnerable people in mind to begin with. But then whenever you read some of the stories about these fascist cops who are literal neo-Nazis, you have cops who are literally impregnating leftist activists, as undercover agents, just disgusting stuff like that. It happens every single day. So as much as I would love to believe that the state could, make inroads in fighting this kind of terrorism, I just, I don't have much faith in them myself personally. And that's why I think we as anarchists, as leftists, need to be focusing on building our own dual power structures, building our own direct action campaigns, in solving these problems for ourselves as a movement, making our communities safe ourselves, looking to success stories from the past when it comes to community defense, looking at examples like the Black Panthers in the United States of America, who were incredibly successful at policing their own communities and policing the police and forcing the state to pay attention where they needed to, and that's not just it's not just about fighting the Nazis. It's also about empowering vulnerable people. It's also about doing things like the Black Panthers did when they implemented school lunch programs and, educational and health campaigns and that sort of thing. We have to attack it on all fronts. We have to be scientific in the way that we develop our, frankly, revolutionary activity to fight these Nazis. Because if we only focus on one thing or one aspect, if we're not connected, if we're not unified into a united front, the Nazis they have their shit together, so we have to have our shit together and be very strategic and collaborative in how we attack these problems.
I think that's totally true. There's recently in Germany, where of course the police have like an even perhaps more kind of dubious relationship with Nazism. Recently in, I think it's Hesse, part of Germany, where like the police have been really consistently slow to prosecute neo-Nazis. Well, of course, in Germany it's a crime to be a neo-Nazi. They've been really slow to prosecute neo-Nazis. They've also been really slow to assign a political motive to the kinds of racist murders that have been going on in Germany with the National Socialist movement and a bunch of neo-Nazis who were kind of prepping for doomsday. There's the real kind of failure of the state to do these kind of things. Yeah, and I don't think that we can trust them at all. I think you're totally right about that.
I've got a few German comrades, and from what I understand, things are actually a lot worse there than it seems based on like national or international media, like doesn't cover it very much. But apparently there is a huge undercurrent of fascist activity in Germany. So yeah, that is a place to be on guard as a leftist for sure.
I have a last question on YouTube. You put out all your content through YouTube, and as a platform, it's not, the most progressive thing in the world. In fact, it's not progressive at all. And recently we had channels like 3 Hours being banned. We have anarchist, leftist, anti-fascist content regularly being demonetized. Should we be staying on YouTube? And if so, how can we be contesting these kinds of like algorithm-driven bannings and censoring from YouTube? I know you said in your video that you're against censorship in general, and I completely agree with that, but we need to, how do we protect ourselves from having our message shut down?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if I was clear enough in my video. It's not so much that I'm like against censorship in and of itself. It's just that, again, I'm incredibly skeptical that YouTube or any capitalist corporate entity has the wherewithal to properly do censorship. I mean, I'm all for stopping Nazis from speaking. To me, it's more successful when it's done by things like the direct action campaigns we see on college campuses, which literally has blocked notable Nazis from speaking, and direct action campaigns to like, from the bottom up. If YouTube really did have the capacity and ability and commitment to ban Nazis from the platform, of course, I'm all for that. But I don't see it going down that road. In fact, what I actually see happening is very heavy-handed, completely thoughtless activity where they are, just demonetizing LGBTQ plus and removing leftist creators. They're basically, the way that corporations respond to these problems, the way that PayPal did it, the way that Patreon has done it, is they say, okay, they have the horseshoe theory mindset. The fascists are bad, so the anti-fascists are also bad. We'll just ban both sides, and look, we've solved the problem. So, that's why PayPal and Patreon have banned Antifa activist organizations, because in their twisted capitalist hell world mindset, that's the thing to do. If you're going to ban the Nazis, you also ban the anti-Nazis. For some reason, that makes sense to organizations like YouTube. So that's what I mean when I say that I'm against corporate censorship. It's not that I want Nazis to be talking on these platforms. It's just that YouTube's not going to do a good job at this. So again, it's on us as a community to, and so as far as like leaving YouTube, that's something that I've been on this topic since the beginning because I work, my background is in media and marketing, and I know that, the medium is the message, and having control over the medium and the platform gives you control over everything, essentially. I mean, you could say that we have free speech on YouTube, but we absolutely do not. The algorithm, the monetization policies, there are a lot of, it's a huge opaque system that we have no say in, and it's a very authoritarian system, and it's very much against the interests of vulnerable people, working people. So we do need to have our own platform, for one thing, as a backup, because I have no doubt in my mind that as leftism, anarchism, communism, as these ideas start to grow and blossom and become stronger, that's when capitalism is going to start nailing us down, banning us, blocking us from using these platforms. It will happen eventually. So from a long-term perspective, we absolutely need our own platform. In the short term, though, it's really rough because as leftists, we need to be communicating where the people are. We need to be speaking where people are listening. So it's a huge problem, and we as a movement need to, again, get our shit together and have these conversations and make these difficult decisions on how we do that and how we get people moving en masse to other, better platforms.
I have one really last question about the future. So
yeah,
it seems like there's this really interesting book by a guy called Joshua Citarella called Politigram. So Politigram is kind of the political part of Instagram. That's the kind of term he uses for it. And you get people on there who have these kind of wild, novel combinations of, like North Korean ideology, Juche, and like neo-reactionary Jewish Christians, or right. Like eco-Bolshevist, anarchist, monarchists. How does any of this stuff fit together? And it seems like one of the kind of features of this fragmentation is not just fragmentation into the right, but just fragmentation across the political spectrum. People are just making up the most kind of random combinations of things, and to some extent, I really welcome that. I think the possibility of thinking about politics in just a kind of really experimental way, in this really speculative way, is immensely liberating. But I think that this kind of random generator increasingly seems to be subject to a kind of selection. So one way in which these random ideas have been selected for is that you get lots of fascists. In the long term, what do you see as the kind of dynamics that would like push something to be selected? And what do you think is going to be the dominant ideology on the internet in like 10 years' time? How are things going to change?
So I would present two scenarios. One would be like the worst case scenario, and the other would be best case. So worst case, the left continues to fragment, and we use these different labels to wall ourselves off from each other. We cancel anybody who doesn't, fit into our very narrow bandwidth of like what's ideologically correct, and we eat ourselves, which leftists are very prone to do. I mean, I'm a big proponent for, at the very least, tactical unity between leftists of different stripes. So I could definitely see that happening. And if that's the case, then we're screwed, because in 10 years' time, that's right around when the climate crisis has us completely irreversibly screwed. The military security industry is going to have developed amazing things to oppress the working class in ways we haven't yet imagined or conceived of. Automation is going to be destroying one of our last bargaining chips, which is our labor, and we'll, probably just everyone on Earth will die while Elon Musk and company fly off to Mars and start their own utopia. So that's the worst case scenario. Yeah, no, I hope it doesn't go that way. I mean, if we keep going in the direction that we are, there's a chance that could happen. But what I really hope would happen instead is that these kinds of labels are prompts for discussions and debates that are productive, and that we embrace the diversity of ideas that we have on the left, the diversity of ideas that are inclusive and liberating. And I hope that we, I've learned so much. My partner on my channel is a Vietnamese Marxist-Leninist woman named Luna. And, she studies the Ho Chi Minh School of Marxist-Leninism. I am not a Marxist-Leninist myself, as much as many segments of my YouTube audience think I'm becoming a Marxist-Leninist. I'm not. But from talking to her...
It's inevitable, comrade. It's inevitable.
But from talking to her and talking to other, Marxist, Leninists, and Maoists and that sort of thing, I've learned a lot. And what it does, it makes me a better anarchist, I think. It forces me to think about things from different perspectives. There are good ideas that I could borrow, and I can have influence on them as well and inject, my anarchist perspective into their worldview. So I think having that dialogue is very healthy. I like to think that, this is like kind of a pie in the sky optimist view that perhaps goes against my better judgment. But I like to think that in about 10 or 15 years' time, the left will kind of gel into a cohesive front. I like the idea of a united front. We can debate and discuss and disagree in the rear amongst ourselves. But when it comes to fighting capitalism and fighting oppression and fighting racism and hatred, I like to think that we will find a way to present a united front and have these conversations and these debates productively without disintegrating. That's what I would like to think would happen. And it seems like it would go one way or the other, because it's really a do or die, all or nothing kind of situation that we're facing as a planet. Yes,
I think the climate angle is like incredibly important here. The possibility of something like a coherent like eco-fascism arising is I think personally like the real threat, and that would mean
it's terrifying.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else you want to be asked? Do you have anything else you don't get to talk about that like you really like want to say?
Well, I'm actually just about right after we finish this conversation, I'm going to be uploading my new video, which is on revolution and the different strategies that we have, available as revolutionaries, and why I advocate for revolution over reform. So maybe that's just something I would let your audience know. That'll probably be online by the time that they listen to this. And beyond that, I just want to thank you for having me on the show. And it's been, I'm sorry if I rambled too much, but I did enjoy talking to you. And
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a huge amount. Do go and subscribe to Non-Compete. That's non-compete.com and Non-Compete on YouTube. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/12, that's 12 rules for what, and donating $2. There are actually 3 different tiers now. There's $2, which will get you our eternal gratitude. There's $5, which will get you access to a further reading list that we've compiled of our research through the week. And then there's $10, which will get you our notes that we've taken for the episodes.
You can also rate and review us in iTunes. That really does help us. And follow us, retweet our stuff, help us do our own promotion for us.
Signal boosting is of immense importance in the internet now.
It's essentially practice, and it's really important to do.
Thanks for listening.